Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to Bera and Wera for inviting me and the honor to be here and to coordinate this presentation. I'm Professor Giovanna Lunardi from Santa Catarina State University from Brazil, and I'm Vice President for Wera. It's a particular pleasure for me to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Kris Gutiérrez, who has so kindly accepted our invitation. Professor Kris Gutiérrez is the Carol Liu Chair and Distinguished Professor and former Association Dean at the Berkeley School of Education, University of California, Berkeley. Gutiérrez expertise is in the learning science, literacy, policy, and qualitative and design-based approaches. Gutiérrez is a member of National Academy of Education, the American Academy of Arts and Science, and fellow of the British Academic. She is a fellow of the ARA and the International Society of Learning Science, and the Osher Fellow, the Exploration and Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Science. Gutiérrez is the past president of ARA and vice chair of the National Board of Institutional Education Science. Gutiérrez research is a main learning in design environment with attention to cultural, historic, and ecological resilience, and the approach to literacy and STEAM learning with immigrant and translingual students population. Her work in social design-based experiment with issues of equity and learning in design, which has published premier academic journals and has won numerous awards. She has a long-standing collaboration with immigrant and migration communities, and her empirical studies are funded by different prestigious foundations. She served on the U.S. Department of Education and was a member of Obama's education policy transition team. Let's go to Worldmaking for Just Education Futures, a utopian vision and methodology with Professor Kris Gutiérrez.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So first I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It was a delight to be part of WERA, and do you say Bera? Or, yeah. And it was particularly delightful because, as my colleague said, last year I was elected to the British Academy, and that was such a surprise. I have lots of lovely colleagues here, but my long-standing relationship with the UK was that my landlady of our first apartment before my parents bought their first house was from Cornwall. And I wasn't going to say this, but I have to say this. And so before we bought it, she loved my mother. She had lost her daughter. And so every day, my mother learned to make all English food. We grew up with pasties and saffron bread, and we would have high tea with her every day, my mother and I. And it wasn't until about when I was 10 or 11 that I knew that Mexican origin people didn't do this regularly, that this was actually an English tradition. So there's a long history with my relationship here, I think. And Mrs. Kopp would be very proud of me today, I think. So I have several aims today. My first one, which is not on the slide, is to get through it. I have been here for 3 weeks doing various keynotes and talks, and I have gotten really ill. Not a contagious ill, so you won't worry, but something, and so that's why I'm sitting, and that's why I may grab something, some juice or something at any moment, so I just want to make sure you know that, so that we want to do this. It's a collaborative effort here for me to get through this. So my talk has several aims today. To argue the fierce urgency of reimagining, designing, and enacting a utopian vision and methodology central to a robust and sustainable democratic education. 2, to argue that Robust conceptions of human learning and culture as dynamic have been largely absent from the education policy and practice and design of educational environments and tools, and this is true globally. To proffer a utopian blueprint informed by a utopian approach, I co-designed and implemented with colleagues what I have termed social design-based experiments, and to offer several examples to elaborate this vision in the form of concrete utopias, examples that help us rise to the concrete in imagining new educational and social futures for all youth, educators, researchers, policymakers, communities, and stakeholders in this collective project. Allow me to first define what I mean by utopian approach. I draw on my own design-based approach, which is informed by cultural historical approaches to learning and development, and ecological and critical approaches to inquiry. I intentionally use the term experiment as a reclamation of the notion of the experiment in a more classical sense. You know, to test something to see if you can learn something, or to discover something, or to see if something is true or works. Developed nearly 3 decades ago, social design-based experiments, but I'll say SDBEs to give a shorthand, involve proleptic or future-oriented forms of imagination and design that are organized around a utopian ideal and methodology. That is, imagining and designing an ideal ecology with possible futures, as Mike Cold, cultural psychologist from the US, has written. However, these outcomes are not fixed, as in traditional notions of utopia, but instead utopia's aims are better understood as what I call moving horizons of possibility. Thus, rather than static or stable, these utopian ideals can pull collectives forward, including institutions, in a process through which goals are necessarily reimagined, iterated, and modified. My work on SDBEs has been developed in conversation with conceptions of utopia with roots in traditions of inquiry in sociology and cultural historical theory, for example. One example, our work found resonance with sociologist Levitas' conception of utopia as the expression of the desire of a better way of being or of living, and as such is braided through human culture, she says. SDBEs, as a utopian methodology, are concerned with possible futures and, to quote Levitas, human flourishing in the context of those possible futures. This conception of utopia is affective, cognitive, and material, one that moves between the present and the future, and as such sustains the tension between rereading the present from the standpoint of the future, transforming it into the history as a future, as Levitas once wrote. And you will see why shortly, why I argue that social design-based experiments is a utopian approach. The helix here highlights the key design principles that I believe would be generative for imagining educational projects across scale. SDBEs are cultural historical formations concerned with academic and social consequences, transformative potential, and new trajectories for historically vulnerable people, especially people from what I use the term non-dominant communities. You could probably help me pick a better one, but we use non-dominant because it wasn't about demographics, it was about power. So non-dominant for me tries to get at the issue of power, which is often ignored, so collectively maybe we can find a better word. SDBEs seek to create and study change. As educational and social interventions, they design for new learning as well as unlearning stereotypic or deficit perceptions of learners and their communities. As educational experiments, like other design experiments, SDBEs are grounded in empirically derived hypotheses about learning and human development, human activity, social life, for example, but are iterated, implemented, and continuously reflected upon, refined, and repaired over the course of their experiments. In other words, these are theoretically and experientially informed models of the future that are co-designed, studied, and revised in the present. A utopian methodological approach, then, necessarily involves the rich documentation of present human social activity and their histories to reconceptualize the past and imagine new futures. This is crucial for supporting and understanding individuals, their communities, and schools in the process of transformation and change. That is co-imagining with radical possibilities, especially for those from historically non-dominant communities. SDBEs are organized around a set of design principles and commitments to transform the educational and social circumstance of members of communities as a means of promoting social and educational equity and consequential learning. Animated by commitments that aim to make possible, sustainable, and dignified lives for all human beings, learning scientists and other scholars who engage in such work seek to create and study change in partnership with a range of communities in which new practices and futures are always co-designed. As educational and social interventions, SDBEs address the challenges of leveraging cultural diversity and reducing social inequality by designing for new learning in which the practices and learners and communities are made consequential. I highlight the design principles as a foreshadowing of the history of a constellation of methods at work in a utopian approach. Again, principles I'm confident will serve in the larger project of a democratic education as a utopian project. And I recently had a piece in RRE, thanks one of the co-editors, that kind of talks about these methods in particular, if you're interested. Excuse me. Grounded in critical learning sciences and cultural historical approaches to learning and human development, and design commitments around ecological resilience, transformability, sustainability, and diversity. Researchers in this tradition, including the participants with whom we collaborate, attend to historicity, and in doing so, orients us to document history in the present. That is, understanding the genesis of practices, values, and meanings to participants. Understanding the affordances and constraints of the ecology, locally and historically. So I just want to insert that you'll see at the bottom of this, you should be able to see Walker and Salt. These were just wonderful researchers who do work in ecological resilience and whose work I adapted, and I was so curious whether I'm using it in the right way, and I sent them my paper and they said, oh, how interesting, yes, that works. So I'm really glad. But what I loved about them is we're focusing on ecological resilience here, and I'll say more about that now. This is why, for me, practice is such a generative unit of analysis. Practices are socially, culturally organized, and this provide opportunity to trace historical influences in the present, while also accounting for iterations and variations of those practices in the present. Recall also that culture is not static or monolithic. This attention to history helps open up the process of prolepsis. That is, the cultural mechanism, as Mike Cole wrote, that brings the past into the present, making prolepsis an important design principle in the development of youth's future selves and a future-oriented agenda. This highlights a central premise of SDBEs, that learning is organized as a formative anticipation of a possible future, as Vasugi once wrote. The realization of a potential, she says, through a process of prolepsis, a mediated representation and nascent experiences of the future and the present. SDBE's proleptic orientation seeks to advance methods of inquiry and design organized around imagining what is not yet. We are most interested in designing not for who the child is, but for who the child can become. That's really this future orientation. In this work, diversity is more than a resource. It is essential to ecological resilience and sustainability. In the ecological sense, diversity means greater variability, essential to transformability. An ecology without diversity simply can't thrive. I find this a much more useful and generative understanding of the importance of diversity as being fundamental to the preservation and thriving of human and all other forms of life, an understanding that should compel us to rethink the ways we conceive of and employ the concept of diversity in our scholarship. There's also persistent emphasis on equity across the design process, that is, in its theorization, design, implementation, and ongoing iterations. A design process I have termed, equity by design. However, equity within this design method is better understood for me as future or world making, in which pragmatic realizations of equity, that is, their concrete manifestations in people's everyday lives, including the institutions they traverse, replace equity as simply an aspirational goal. And that's something I see over and over in the literature, where equity at best is this aspiration, this ideal, with little attention to making it material in the lives of people. Equity here is manifest in concrete utopias, as SCBEs are both future-oriented and simultaneously concerned with the here and now, the material conditions in which people are experiencing, while also imagining social futures. Both aspects are essential to world making. I particularly resonate with Goodman's notion of world making, advanced, believe it or not, in 1978. He says, world making always starts from worlds already at hand. The making is a remaking. This conception of world making resonates strongly with my theoretical approaches to learning, for which everyday practices, those already at hand, or the cultural, if you want to use that term, are fundamental to learning. In my work, the integration and reorganization of the everyday, or the horizontal, and the formal, the vertical, forms of learning are essential to expansive and consequential learning. What I'm arguing here is that it's not enough to just talk about the everyday, right? Not without giving you a lesson in learning theory, right? We know that deep learning happens when there's a reorganization of everyday and formal kinds of knowledge, right? I have elaborated this point in my continued work on syncretic approaches to learning, recently applied to our work in data sciences and generative AI. World making is also, also generative, as it demands historical and social analysis, evoking what Kondo says, social political transformations in the impossibility of escaping power, history, and culture. All this work certainly makes evident that learning is complex. As Jean Lave, a U.S. Social cultural theorist, reminded us more than several decades ago, that learning occurs is not problematic, as learning is an integral aspect of activity in and with the world at all times. However, she noted, what is learning and how it's learned is always complexly problematic. 1 second to have a sip of water. I draw attention to these key social design principles as they work in mutually reinforcing ways, for consequential, I got drenched coming off from the airplane. That's why I'm coughing, not literally drenched. As they work in mutually reinforcing ways to design for consequential learning and transformations in ecologies that have the potential for ecological resilience and social change, as Walker and Salt have written. However, engaging this work requires meaningful involvement of partners and communities in which key aspects of the iterative research design and implementation process are collaborated. What's key here is that stakeholders collaborate in joint learning activity to identify and redefine the goals of the intervention and make visible the historical dimensions of a community's practices. This approach requires a shift from viewing schools, communities, and other institutions as sites of study, what one of my colleagues used to call, as we treat them as data plantations, as places in which empirical work is conducted, to viewing them as dynamically, mutually constitutive contexts for study that includes partners who have agency for shifting their educational life and life circumstances. Ongoing attention to shifting issues of concern, goals, and resources available in the partnership facilitate the aim of broad social change through the responsive development of what I call small-scale instantiations of realizations of a possible future. So those small-scale instantiations are what we can do now in the here and now to contribute to ameliorating the conditions of people in the here and now. Although these principles work hand in hand to conceive of and implement transformative educational projects, particular emphasis is given to those design elements related to justice and sustained transformability. In previous work, we've illustrated some of the key dimensions of diversity, transformability, and sustainability as fundamental to resilient ecologies, as conceived in the work, again, of our long-term projects, working around mutual relations of exchange with partners to make the case for consequential interventions for youth and families from non-dominant communities. The focus on changing systems and infrastructure is tied to particular notions of equity, resilience, and change. As Levitas noted, it's the nature of that change that's the question. I believe these design principles align in important ways with notions of precarity, sustainability, justice, and utopia, as elaborated by Finnish colleague Antti Rahela and Spanish colleagues of Gutiérrez and Hornet in the cultural historical tradition and their notions of futurity. I also found it really interesting to look at the notions of futurity and sustainability and democracy and political theory, which I'll discuss very shortly. I argue the fierce urgency of now to address the precarious state of public and democratic education across the world, the precarity of its students, faculty, and institution. A robust and just democratic education for all has yet to be realized in most parts of the world. Again, as Spanish colleagues Hornet, Limos, and Guitart have noted, educational opportunity and dignity elude all but 1% who are living at the edge of precarity. The project of re-mediating educational systems must work in and from precarity, both to address educational inequity as well as to address the sustainability problem in education. By the way, the term re-mediation that I have written a lot about is distinguished from the traditional term of just remediation, which is pathologically oriented in its notion of remediation, and is better, the term re-mediation is better understood as to mediate again, to mediate anew, with the focus, however, this time on fixing systems and ecologies, not fixing people or groups of people. As I discussed earlier, the importance of world-making as part of a utopian vision, because of its commitments to the current lived possibilities of people, their thriving now in the present as well as in the future. Relatedly, I found the work of Rosine Keltz quite insightful. Keltz, who studies the role of temporality in political and moral thought, has argued, today representative politics, she's a European scholar by the way, today representative politics are often perceived as being primarily concerned with short-term goals. Moreover, the future appears to be predetermined by economic or technical necessities. The closing of the future, however, becomes increasingly problematic in the face of global existential crises, such as environmental depletion and climate change. These catastrophic developments could only be mitigated by intermediate, decisive political interventions, which would amount to systemic changes that redirect technical research and economic activity." End quote. I agree with Keltz that educational thought, like political thought, should take temporality, and in particular futurity, as central conceptual and methodological concerns. As I mentioned earlier, I take an ecological approach to my work. This long-standing methodological focus has been further elaborated by my adaptation of the work, as I mentioned earlier, of the resilience ecology and their sociological view of managing the environment. Walker and Salt's ideas of adaptive management, a strategy developed in response to management for optimization or efficiency that dominated environmental management for most of the 20th century, unfortunately parallels orientation in education research and policy today. The emphasis in both domains has been on optimization instead of resilience and sustainability. The paradox of efficiency and optimization from this perspective is that optimization in the sense of maximizing efficiency through tight control is largely part of the problem, not the solution. This certainly characterizes current educational reform across the globe, in which schools, teachers, and students increasingly operate in tight cultures. That is, cultures with top-down control and few degrees of freedom for teachers, students, for teachers and students, cultures that undermine resilience and sustainability. Findings from my own studies in the U.S. that has examined educational reform in reading and literacy surface these same understandings. I also witnessed increased emphasis on optimization and an imagined efficiency in increasing numbers of schools of education in the U.S. that replace imagination, commitments to inquiry that's consequential to the field and to the social educational good. They are being replaced by technocratic concerns and goals of efficiency rather than inquiry for the educational and social good. I've also had the opportunity to examine management for optimization or efficiency at the federal level in the U.S. as part of a federal panel on reading first. We had a lot of reading wars in the U.S. And also as a member of President Obama's education policy transition team, and later as a presidential appointment and vice chair of the National Board of Educational Sciences, which is the research arm of the Department of Education in the U.S. I have so many stories to share about that time, but of relevance here is how despite the expansive goals of the Obama administration, the political machinery and its attendant institutionalized structures and ideologies defaulted to the norm, the efficient, with little attention to the complexity about which I argue today. But now it's time to rise to the concrete, to more explicitly illustrate some of the arguments I have made here. I turn to a real-world example from the field of architecture that highlights the conceptual and methodological approaches that I have presented today. There are a number of interdisciplinary approaches that I could have used. However, this particular architectural program of work is an architecture of context and complexity that harnesses the history of the environmental and socio-cultural ecology to build new houses while also building a new vision of community living in precarious environments. As in education, this example is generative of a new imagination that conceives of resilience over cultural historical time, a resilience that encompasses ecological thinking about social and environmental systems, including educational systems. Placing a high premium on diversity and its role in mediating and sustaining viable and thriving communities was also the organizing principle of a robust sociological intervention in New Orleans, Louisiana, the host city of the 2011 American Educational Research Association, the year I was AERA president. The New Orleans region had experienced catastrophic human, environmental, and social educational devastation. Its entire infrastructure had been destroyed and had been undergoing a very difficult recovery. The city helped to inspire my conference theme, which was Inciting the Social Imagination, Education Research for the Public Good, which I was very proud of. But first, some cultural and historical context and geographical context. New Orleans, which is in Louisiana in the southern part of the U.S., is a remarkable city with an amalgam of cultural practices that contribute to vibrant intercultural exchange, that retain elements of their historical character, and that remain in tension with other enduring customs and belief, as well as its geography. Pierce Lewis once described New Orleans as an inevitable city on an impossible site because of the geography. Within its thin, hydric soils and mosquito-infested swamps at or below sea level, surrounded by water and vulnerable to hurricanes and severe floods. When the ARA Program Committee visited New Orleans in preparation for the annual meeting, we participated in a very thoughtful and respectful tour of the Lower Ninth Ward, the most devastated area. I was moved not only by the humanitarian efforts, but also by the humanity of some of the interventions that were taking hold. The Make It Right Foundation was one such example, with its goal to build safe, sustainable, and affordable homes for working families who had been homeowners prior to Katrina, the Hurricane Katrina. But let me insert a footnote here. The project, started by the actor Brad Pitt, was laudable in so many ways, but ultimately failed for a myriad of political and legal reasons, and an unfortunate but important example of how much more work is needed to be done, especially with the community and its practices. It nevertheless was an important example of utopian designing. Many of its designers initially organized their efforts around diversity, resilience, and sustainability in ways aligned with social cultural theory, the social cultural history of the ward and its families. At the same time, their goal had been to build and sustain future trajectories for families and communities. Systemic change in this model of intervention is not addressed by attempts to scale up effective interventions alone, but rather to imagine new interdisciplinary models and dynamic interventions towards systemic improvements across larger timescales. The project's division of labor supported collaboration to ensure the best development of green, safe, affordable, and ecologically valid structures, and an orientation best exemplified by the float house, which you see here. The float house, one of the design homes in the project, was a response to ecological fragility. I think this was so brilliant. The float house sits on a 4-foot-high base and chassis that's equipped with modern conveniences. Built for safety, affordability, and sustainability, this floatable home maintains some of the traditions of the New Orleans homes in its essential front porch and its culture. But the concept of the house, consider all the kinds of studies that were done to produce this house. Consider all the facets of the study, which included understanding the flooding record of the Lower Ninth Ward, the social cultural history of the city and the Lower Ninth Ward, and the deep understanding of the ecology of the Mississippi Delta. Maine and his colleagues focused on real-world design for social impact, what I'm arguing we need to do in education, and advocated for an architecture that, as Maine notes, is filled with hope and most immense sense of joy, of possessing and acknowledging of what is possible, meaning what it means to be human. For Maine, who's the main architect, architecture has a way of seeing, of thinking, and of questioning our world and our place in it. Maine's vision harkens back to our utopian vision of the importance of an imagination, picturing and modeling a future in the Rortovskian sense. Maine's work here, though, is not an a priori dehistoricized conceptualization, but rather is historically and locally developed. He says, it's a result, a manifestation of the process that formed it, investigating, prioritizing information specific to the cultural, urban, political, and ecological content, and architecture of context regarding its place and circumstance. I love that, an architecture of context, place, and circumstance. Imagine that education, too, was about context and history and place and circumstance. So I'm going to show you a brief video of Maine talking about it. It's very, very short, that I think kind of brings to life the arguments that he's making. Let's see, how do I do it so it starts?
A year later, we're getting a call through Brad Pitt, would you participate in building a house? It seemed as though it was impossible to do. We just were on record and then finished the study saying, no, we should vacate the ninth ward and turn it back into a natural, pure state or whatever, right? And we realized that actually it was a really opportunity, and that what it meant is that we're going to design a residence for the condition that we're defining. And all of it having to do with producing something low cost. We wanted to build a house for actually $100,000. Without any doubt, the most interesting part is the chassis, and it floats, of course. And it wasn't meant that people would stay in the house during a storm, but your possessions would be the house itself would be remaining, etc. But in the chassis is everything. All the electrical, all the plumbing. We have a battery backup system for both safety and for day-to-day use. We have photovoltaic. You look at the smallest kind of event of building this small-scale house and how it completely connects to the larger, broader economic, social, cultural issues. Once you start doing something that actually affects people's lives, that shapes human behavior, right? That's meant to somehow enhance or shift human behavior. Now there's going to be, you're in a political territory and there's going to be a conversation, but it probably immediately means you're up to something.
I love that. He says when you're starting to get into political territory, that means when you're getting into something, like when you're getting into something good. How often we shun that in educational research. Before I get to my second example, my second and final example, I just want to highlight several conceptual and methodological principles that support such utopian projects concerned with addressing precarity, injustice, and sustainable resilient ecologies. First, as I learned in my policy work, especially at the federal level, the optimization and efficiency model works hand in glove with approaches that flatten out differences that matter among people, contributing to stereotypic or overly general and simplistic understandings of people, their practices, and communities and possibilities. In my work with policymakers, this is when things were better in the US, in this instance, 20 US senators and congressmen, I had to come up with something that could clearly communicate the importance of complexity, because at the federal level they want you to say it in one page without any nuance. I had to come up with something that could clearly communicate the importance of complexity rather than a short-term notion of efficiency. I use this image of a binocular to suggest that these policy makers might shift from using a singular lens to understand the educational needs of the youth. A generous view would suggest that policymakers understood the larger target cohort, such as English learners or special needs students, terms, by the way, that I don't use but are used by the government. That is, the lawmakers likely generally understood the problem space, who the members of the cohort were, and their general needs. However, I argued that to better understand the issues and needs of these youth required the use of a second lens to develop more complete knowledge of the cohort, specifically their significant variability and their vastly different needs. If you know translingual populations, they are among the most diverse populations in the world, and yet we treat them and make policy and write curriculum around them as a cohort. A binocular lens would help eliminate the one-size-fits-all approaches to education, the outcome of the singular lens of cohort. It may lead to solutions that actually might make a difference for vast numbers of youth. Another common research practice is to make assumptions, judgments, claims about youth learning by observing them in one practice or activity system, often just assessing them in a classroom or a school. Observations that are insufficient to capture what Barbara Rogoff and I call people's repertoires of practice. And essentially and quickly, what we're talking about is that learning takes hold as people move in and across the events of everyday life, and they develop repertoires, right? And these repertoires, stem from participation in long-standing practices. So while you might have you might have proclivity to engaging in practices in a particular way, it's not because it's race or genetic in any single way. So we think it's really much more productive, for example, in terms of understanding learning and pedagogy. It's much more useful for me to know, it's not useful at all for me to know that Juan can't do math. It's so much more useful for me to know in terms of policy and curriculum and teaching what Juan's history of involvement with mathematics is. what one's repertoire around math or literacy is. That's his repertoire of practice. This, of course, means conceiving of culture as a verb. As my dear colleague, recently departed colleague Luis Moll wrote, if you want to understand people's culture, you have to know how they live culturally. That's why thinking about culture as a verb is so important, especially to these, to really deeply understanding the people's repertoires. Thus, the conduct of my utopian designs, in the conduct of my designs, I hold a methodological commitment to a multi-sided approach across a minimum of several activity systems to better account for youth learning and sense-making, following them from school, home, to the corner, to wherever they go, to deconstruct the narrow notions of learning that reinstantiate inequities in the everyday schooling. And instead, I focus on co-designing consequential learning ecologies in which youth are free to move beyond the constraints on their lives as learners, to become historical actors towards an expansive utopia. The conceptual metaphor of learning as movement that I've written about acknowledges the multiplicity of the social spaces in learning ecologies and their grammars, and demands attending to how people's repertoires are constituted through their participation in routine activity as they move across the ecologies and practices of everyday life. This analytic frame, learning as movement, or LAM, focuses attention again on what takes hold, on how people's lives get reorganized, and what is made consequential in people's movement, with attention to the complexity of infrastructures and environments that make visible what critical geographer, spatial theorist, and my former late colleague Ed Soja said. These were geographies of consequentiality. We want to capture and understand geographies of consequentiality. With this context in mind, an important consideration of utopian methodology is to draw on models that recognize that learning ensues as people move in across the socially, culturally, and historically organized practices of everyday life. This focus on movement across a range of practices makes visible the complexity of human activity and how people's repertoires are constituted. This attention to the learning and people's movement within and across practices invites researchers to employ more expansive methods of inquiry, to push on claims on people's learning about a phenomenon based on a few observations or observations that do not account for their fuller range of repertoires and their participation in social action, a point I made earlier. This certainly highlights the methodological imperative to be ethnographers of movement that Shadeen Vasugi and I have written about and drawn from Hague, rather than serving as ethnographers of stillness, to use Hague's term. Following my colleague Fred Erickson and Hague, we problematize the analytic snapshot as a method to capture as the endpoint of inquiry. And instead, we seek to craft a moving picture of social practice and human development as it unfolds genetically in real time. As ethnographers of movement, we commit to collaborative and future-oriented design with a sustained focus on the unfolding and developmental nature of the social life people develop across their ecology. This involves what John Jackson calls, in response to Geertz's thick description, he says we need thin description. A real documentation of human activity. The central focus here again is on what takes hold, what travels, gets reorganized. In that movement, including people's tools. We did a study where we looked at not only children moving back and forth from our after-school club, but to their home, not only following people, but following the tools, how the tools were used and how they got reorganized, reanimated in different contexts. So I'm getting to the closing here. So across my work, I have sought to create utopias at various scales, from the federal level to the classroom and to programs. My latest endeavor, believe it or not, attempted to do so at the level of the university. I am currently the Special Assistant to the Vice Chancellor for Research. And the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research actually supported my idea to launch a utopian project in the form of a small seed funding initiative that would support the formation of interdisciplinary teams to prepare for fundamental opportunities, to advance innovative and integrative interdisciplinarity, to the approaches and the study of climate and environmental equity. For example, these teams could address climate and environmental equity at the local, community, regional, or global scale. We encourage research that brought a diversity of approaches and integrated a range of disciplinary perspectives across campus to study complex problems, and who brought expansive notions of equity, interdisciplinarity, and intergenerational configurations to their mutual constitution. Now, I won't have time to show you all this, but I will. But what I want to just have you see that this this project, and I'm so excited about it, I have to tell you. We just got all the applications and we selected them. And you know, my institution, no names included, you know, they were very supportive, but they were a little skeptical whether anybody would be interested or whether it would work. And they were so surprised they got more applications than any other local initiative. And they were brilliant. People got it. They really understood what it meant to do kind of, they didn't know the term utopia. And I never said words like diversity, inclusion. No, I wanted expansive notions to be at work. So what were we looking for? Well, we wanted people who embraced an integrated notion of interdisciplinarity, a work that sits at the edges of disciplines. You know, that's what the most exciting work is, at the edges of disciplines, because those people understand that they have to work interdisciplinarily, right? So that it invites intellectual and disciplinary boundary crossing. So we imagine teams composed of individuals who traditionally are not in conversation with you. And we actually said that in the RFP I wrote. We want people who normally aren't sitting in the same room together talking, including STEM fields and the social sciences, humanities, and professional schools. We wanted questions that were intellectually ambitious, consequential, and that sought nuance and complexity while proposing actionable paths forward. We also wanted expansive approaches to equity. And I wasn't prescriptive about it. I just said, I use Worldmaking Impossible Futures. But what I wanted them to do was think beyond the traditional notions of broadening participation and kind of weak notions of kind of equity. I asked them to develop equity indices, as I have in my own work. These indices serve as guardrails, right? They serve as guardrails to monitor whether equity is persisting, being sustained across the whole enterprise. And repeatedly asking yourself, which is my fundamental question, is the community better off with me having been there? This is one of the ongoing kinds of questions that align with the kind of equity indices. We told them they had to have intergenerational configurations, from undergraduates to postdocs to senior people, not just to be inclusive, but because young folks are also on the cutting edge of new ideas, that we wanted to kind of rupture some commonplace understandings. And then finally, we said, bring all this together to really take on a consequential problem in climate and environmental equity. And they did. More to be, I hope they'll let me write about that soon, because I'm eager to. So in conclusion, I want to say that what I've tried to argue today is that at their best, social design-based experiments, like those I mentioned today, have the potential to become lived arguments for the possible, what Wartofsky referred to as imaginative artifacts that color the way we see the actual world, providing a tool for changing current practice. And if perception is historically and culturally mediated, as Wartofsky has argued, and I agree, then we must ask ourselves, colleagues, what perceptions of education are we reimagining for our youth, for our communities, for our society, and for the world? Thank you. I've been dying to get a Kleenex the whole time.
Thank you so much, Professor Kris. It was amazing and inspiring lecture, so many examples, and it's fascinating. Thank you so much. We start to believe again it's possible to change the world after a lecture. We have some time, and we can open for a few questions, if someone would like to start here.
Do you need a mic?
No, I think they give that.
Thanks, yeah. It's Jack White at University of Cumbria. When you mentioned your presidential address, I was just thinking, a few years earlier than your address, Catherine Snow focused on the nature of the embodied knowledge of teachers, saying that she felt that we needed to develop systematized approaches to make that knowledge public. Now, I've really enjoyed your presentation, and I've learned a lot from it. I was trying to relate it to my own interests in professional development of teachers through educational research. And it felt to me that your utopian approach with its methodology literally should have implications for the professional development of the teaching forces around the world. And I wondered if you managed any success in influencing the curriculum with your utopian methodology in relation to the professional learning and development of teachers, so that that knowledge could be made public, as Catherine Snow has been advocating.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I'm always causing trouble everywhere I go, but it's good trouble. And when I was at UCLA, I wanted to do this very same thing in teacher education, because I've always been, I have this love-hate relationship with teacher education. I love teachers, but I hate the kinds of narrow conceptions of who they could become in teacher education, right? So I'm always there because I want to be championing teachers, and I know what's possible. So they actually, once again, allowed me, and I asked them, this is really kind of crazy, but I said, can you give me a whole cohort of new teachers, new pre-service teachers, and I'll teach them everything. No matter what class it is, they'll be with me, and we'll be a team for the year. And they actually let me do it. But the design, I wanted to use this very approach because, in teacher education, classrooms, we put them in classrooms, and classrooms are actually black boxes that are really hard to imagine possibilities because they're so encumbered, right, with so many rules and regulations and little imagination unless the teacher's given the degrees of freedom to do so. So what I did in this social design experiment in teacher education was to this cohort that I worked with, that they're learning. We went to a school, the elementary school, in which I partnered an after-school club that was a social design-based experiment, in which play in the imaginary situation and all these rich forms of learning were central. And so these teacher candidates had to first be in that design space, this utopian kind of oriented space, co-learning with students, in which they developed the most expansive understandings of learning, of teaching, learning side by side with kids, as they were also studying concepts and theories and pedagogy. So they were first in these after-school clubs. And so they would work regularly with youth. They would partner with youth in these intergenerational configurations, all the things that I'm talking about with the youth. And then we wanted teachers to benefit from them, the regular teachers in the school. So these pre-service teachers would be doing cognitive ethnographies on the learning that was going on with themselves and the children. So that was really serious kind of learning, but also fun. We had a magical wizard, El Maga, not to be confused MAGA with the Trump MAGA. This is MAGA meaning wizard. It's kind of a benevolent kind of a dictator. And so what would happen that the teachers would study, document learning with their children in this design space that was saturated with tools and forms of assistance, the way we think good classrooms should be. And then what they did was they followed the youth back into the classroom and observed and documented learning there. And we didn't want to go good, bad. We didn't want to fall into that game. But instead the operating question was, why is it that Elizabeth can do this in the after-school setting, but not in the classroom? What's different about the way the ecology and the participation structures and the pedagogy design that you see expansive forms of learning in one and not the other? And this was so useful, and it's the one thing we don't do with pre-service teachers. We put them out in their student teaching or whatever, and the fundamental question they always have is, how do I instantiate what I've learned in contexts that are antithetical to the kinds of things that I'm learning in my university setting? So this dramatically addressed that, and they did so well that the principal it was always a high term, would hire an entire cohort for her school, because she knew these people were well-trained theoretically, methodologically, but also pedagogically, and that they had an imagination for it. And we followed these people across 5 years, and they all became teacher leaders. They had the confidence to kind of mediate across them. So yeah, I've done that for a long time, but I really argue that why aren't we taking advantage of designing some utopian cities in which our teachers can be part of it before they have to go into the traditional black box of the classroom? That's a long answer, but you can see I loved it. Yes, it's late over here.
Thank you very much. I am Dr. Sahar Sliman from the University of Roehampton in London. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's fantastic, and I am fascinated by utopian research. I never heard of it. This is the first time. So I just want to emphasize that I agree when people come together, intergenerational, when people come together, they can, it's empower, it's very empowering, it's power. You mentioned culture as a verb. Could you elaborate, please, more? Why we know it's a noun, why is it a verb?
Because when we think about it as a noun, we tend to focus on, we start to make the assumption that people do what they do based on their membership in a cultural community, right? So that leads to what my colleague Fred Erickson said when he read the article that we wrote. Oh, 100% of this is in the US, 100% of Asian Americans are not good at math, right? Because you have these stereotypes of people, right? And so the reason that it's so hard when we see it as a noun, we tend to think of cultural practices, and we tend to think of cultural practices being static instead of being dynamic, right? And what's really hard for people, unless you're documented, is to understand that there is both regularity in cultural practices. There are practices that are sustained over time, not because they belong to a particular group, but because it has meaning, value, and resonance in that group, so you'll see some sustainability. So you want to be able to account for regularity, but we want to make sure that regularity is not attached to some genetic predisposition to do something, or people's membership, biological membership in a particular community, right? So you see sustainability in practices because of the resonance practices have for communities over historical time. But even those are changing. But at the same time within it, culture is not uniformly shared. So there's tremendous variance even within that regularity. And to think of it like that is almost impossible when you start thinking about it as a noun. Because to understand that, you have to look at what people are doing and how people have changed their practices over time. So analytically, it's just generative to think about it as a verb. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have one question more in here.
Yeah, thank you so much again. This is wonderful. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see technology design playing into this. I can see how someone within the tech world might see this presentation and say, oh, we're doing the same thing because we want to create this new technology that's going to solve problems. But, you know, how often tech companies and tech people are failing at that because they're not really understanding the complexity of the problem, and they're not actually addressing the core issues, they're just addressing some of the symptoms. So how do you see technology playing a role within this process, or how should technology design be a part of this overall work?
Yeah. Well, I could tell you how I've used it, and I'm not the expert, but necessarily it's been part of my world. My after-school programs are organized around technologies, which includes writing, because writing is a technology, right? And so we have privileged technology, one, because we want students to have access to it, but we also knew that that a lot of play and playful imagination, which is a really cognitively loaded activity, right? The playful imagination is at work, like in gaming activity. And we've written a lot and studied that because I think it's really a rich science. And because, you know, we really privilege the playful imagination, technology has just fit in with what we're doing. The kinds of collaboration, whether it was board games or now we do much more, you know, there's some agent sheets, so they're doing some computational development as well. It's always been central to what we've done because of the affordance, right? Because of the affordance, and it also allows us to see different worlds because, as you know better than I, because you're obviously an expert in it, you see how youth go in and out of the worlds in technology. I remember asking my granddaughter, I said, how'd you learn that? She goes, I used a tutorial. And I was like, oh, excuse me. Well, I didn't know, right, but they're moving across time and space, and that's, you actually get to track the repertoires that they develop. So I see technology as being if designed, if the designed environment is good. I don't want to, because I wouldn't let technology loose everywhere. In a really carefully designed environment, technology is fabulous. And we're also working on, with Bill Cope and Mary Calantz's, trying to see how we can use our methods around some generative AI to bring in kind of critical dimensions that we privilege in our work around from Gen AI. And we're writing that now, so I can't elaborate too much. But I think there's such possibilities. My concern has been that technology is seen as the end point rather as a tool. So once we can get schools and teachers and policymakers to see that it's a tool, and every tool has affordances and constraints, right? They're always dual-sided. So if we can start to see how technology is dual-sided and understand the affordances, constraint, and design around them, I think they could be really, really good.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the questions and comments. I would like...
Oh, there's one last one. Let me take that last one. I hope my stuffiness has made me comprehensible.
My name is Carrie Ho. I'm from USA. I teach at a State University in New Jersey, William Patterson University. And one of the reasons I became a teacher educator was you. I'm so glad after 20 years you're still the same. And then inspired by your the framework and theory, and then how you teach teachers and also students. You know, I teach my teachers using the third space. Like, I know you have a lot of constraints, but you can make education equitable for the minority students and diverse, inclusion diverse. But what's the difference between this third space and then your approach, utopian research? So I think I want to go back to a doctoral study again and learn more about that. This is a new thing, and I see a possibility, but my framework is just stuck within this third space.
Yeah.
So can you elaborate more?
That's such a good question, and I think third spaces are utopian spaces. But let me qualify. When we first started doing the work on third space, we were looking for these existing contexts, right, where third spaces could emerge, right? Because I see third spaces as collective zones of proximal development, if you're using the Vygotsky notions. But, so I think they're very utopian in their nature. What I'm trying to do with social design-based experiments is to be more expansive, is to actually design ecologies with all the things that we learned about what made third spaces so generative, right? What made them sites of really kind of, there was contestation. You know, in our early work, we studied that way back then, this was in the 90s, that people always were looking at what the teacher did, and there was very little study on the billions of things that students were doing at the same time. So just trying to acknowledge the multiplicity of social spaces in environments was really a breakthrough for us. And so you can see how all that work led to learning as movement, how so many of the kind of principles around expansive forms of learning that we identified in third space are part of our design of utopian spaces. So I think it's one small instantiation of these utopian projects that we're doing. So I don't see them as different. I think we've built on it. Yes. But let me know. You can email me and write me more questions. So maybe I'll be more. I can be more coherent.
Okay. Any other questions, comments?
Colleagues, I hope this was useful to you. I hope it incited some new ideas and imagination about, because we can just do better. My thing is just we can just do better in what we're doing.
Thank you, Kris. I just have one final question. You mentioned making and remaking. How can we, I'm looking at AI and how we can use AI to increase engagement of learning in STEM subjects. So, and you mentioned making and remaking. So straight away, I thought of making and remaking of AI. So what is your intake on that? Thank you.
I have to think about that, making and remaking, because, you know, with AI, teachers' biggest fear is that people are going to copy. So I'm like, how can we co-opt and say, yeah, but how can they remake that information in ways that, right, are contributing to a different kind of civic thinking, a different kind of civic analysis. I think there's lots of ways to do it, but I don't have anything specific right now except the grants that we're writing that I hope will get funded to do some of this work, because I think it is in that remaking. It's the re-mediation. And the moment we focus just on tools, though, we're going to lose. We have to focus on the larger ecologies in which the tools have particular roles, so we don't want to get lost, right, in what kinds of solutions. We can do our work around tools, but we can't see them independent of the kinds of ecologies that youth are participating in for them to be successful. Thank you, my colleagues.
One more question
Just
for Rocio, and we finish.
No, it's just the last comment, just to say this talk has been wonderful. Kris, we really thank you so much, because it has been inspirational. Without hesitant, we can do better. And I think we can do better thanks to people like you for your all the things you have contributed. This utopian research can become a possibility without doubts. And thank you so much. This has given so much to us. Yeah, I'm speaking on the name of WIRA family, as WIRA Secretary General, but all the WIRA colleagues and friends, thank you so much for this.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.